Hello, 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 and welcome to Humans Writing Your Fans, the podcast that explores the intersection between writing and fandom. My name is Terry Bartley, and I'm your host. So this episode's pretty exciting. I'm talking to fantasy author David R. Slayton. I'm a big fan of his. I've been listening to his book, White Trash Warlock, sort of like a young adult book about like a kid from kind of rural area. And by kid, I mean he's like 18, 20. And he's just kind of like coming into his own and doing investigations and magic. Is very cool. I'm a big fan of it. So definitely check that out if you haven't. And also, he just came out with a new fantasy novel, Dark Moon, Shallow Sea. So we talk about that in the interview. We talk about kind of like what it has been like to start out with something else and then kind of get into the thing that he's super into, which has been kind of cool to kind of like delve into and get a bit of an insight into that. I hate doing this because I feel like it kind of like dates these things, but I've been trying to post more regularly. I've been trying to post these every other week. So I'm going to do a thing I hate doing, which is I'm going to apologize for not being here for a couple weeks. But what's been going on is I actually got pretty sick. I ended up catching pneumonia, and then my entire family caught COVID, and it's been like a whole few weeks of like sickness and things for a while now. And I also, the school year just started. I'm an English teacher for my day job. So it's been sort of overwhelming, and it's just kind of been hard to find the time to like do these intros and things. But I'm back as far as I can tell. Everything seems to be, knock on wood, everything seems to be normal, okay. So I think I'm on track again. But that's where I've been. But I want to talk a little bit about that because not only has it been challenging to find time to do these kinds of things that I really enjoy doing, but it's also been hard to find time to be creative. And I think that when you take a break for a while like that, it's very hard to kind of jump back into it. So I had a conversation with my friend Dustin, who if you've read any of my books and read any of the acknowledgments, you know for sure that Dustin's like my best friend / agent, because like he keeps pushing me and sort of like helping me with all of this writing stuff. And we talked recently about kind of like coming up with some deadlines for like editing my novel and when the other books would have come out, because I talked last week about the idea of like actually wanting to do these books that I was going to kind of like just throw out there. And now I actually want to like put some work into them and make them great. And you know, like just kind of like getting a schedule so I don't sort of like stop doing what I'm doing. But you know, like I've got the developmental edit done already for my novel, so I just want to take the time to get that done. Because I feel like I've been kind of putting it off because I've been trying to write all these projects at the same time. And I think it's just hard to focus when I do that. Because first of all, I know this about myself. I don't love editing. So whenever I can write an original story, I'm more likely to gravitate towards doing that. So if I'm writing original stories for other books while I am editing, I'm more likely to just not edit and just do the story thing. But it's been hard to kind of like motivate myself to get back into it. I think part of it is that I don't love editing, and it's a bit of a slog for me. Like once I get into it, I really enjoy doing it, but it's kind of like hard to initiate myself to get into the editing mode. I literally Googled yesterday how to get into editing mode, and Google was like, I don't know what you mean by that. But it's a thing I've been trying to figure out how to do because I really want to get back into sort of like getting these projects that I'm pretty deep into along, but you know, like it's just hard to kind of like get my mind shifted over into that mode. So, you know, I just want to talk about that a little bit because it just is a challenge because, you know, the thing about being a writer is you gotta write, and the thing about writing is you gotta edit. And that's kind of like the big thing, right? Like that's when it becomes, I feel like your book goes from being a manuscript to being a novel whenever you get into the editing process. Like that's kind of like when that transformation happens. And I need to get it, I need to start doing it. Because the thing is, I love my novel, and I'm so excited for people to read it. And I'm so excited to kind of like showcase what I do and who I am and all those things. And I have a lot of really cool promotional ideas that I'm excited to get into. But I just you gotta do the work. And I think that that's something hard to kind of like remember. And especially whenever you have a day job and whenever you like have family responsibilities and all those things, like it's hard to find the time to do it. And like I said, it's hard to, whenever I do find the time, to not write something new, which is what I really love doing. So I gotta buckle down and just do it. Like I gotta just start doing it because otherwise I never will. But that's kind of like where I've been at lately, is I need to edit. I want to edit. I just got to get my brain in that mode so I can start doing it. So I just got to buckle down and just do it. Like take an hour and start. And then once I start, I know I'm going to start doing it, and that'll be the thing I'm doing. But I just got to start because otherwise I'm just not going to. Well, all right. Uh, if you have any tips, feel free to shoot me an email, press@starlightkingpress.com. I would love to hear your advice because Google did not know how to switch your brain into editing mode. So if you know how to do that, help me out, please. But otherwise, stick around because I have a really great interview with David R. Slayton. He's a great writer. We have a great conversation about being traditionally published and about writing what you love, but then trying to figure out how to publish the things that you don't love as much, but get to kind of like use that to get you to where you want to go. It was a really great conversation. So hang out and listen to that. We'll be right back. All right. Welcome back to Mr. Writers or Fans. I'm joined now with fantasy author David Slayton. So David, thank you so much for joining me. It was so we met at LavenderCon, this convention in DC that was specifically for queer authors. Great experience. It was such a good time. How have you been since then?
Really good. It's good to see you, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so I just started reading the Adam Binder series because you mentioned in our panel, they asked us a question about like what do people say about your work that is unexpected or like kind of bugs you that people keep asking about, and you mentioned that in the first chapter of the first Adam Binder book, there was a character named Tanner who he like made out with, and then like we never see him again. And I thought it was like, like I write fantasy. I just presumed it was going to be like some incubus, some demon, something that like isn't relevant. But like he actually seemed to like actually care and connect with him, and it is kind of funny that we don't see him again. But also, I can tell you, it was one of the most relatable things in my life to like kiss a guy and then be like, "I'm done now. I don't need any more interaction for for a good year or two." I'm like so relatable to me to like just kind of like move on after getting a little bit of a fulfillment of that.
Yeah, Tanner's really funny. Again, I mentioned this at LavenderCon, but it always cracks me up because people are so attached. Like, I'll get these emails like, "When are we ever going to see Tanner again?" And I'm like, I never planned to bring him back, but who knows? As the series progresses and I do more, like we have our spinoff Rogue Community College coming this fall, and you never know we never know. Maybe he'll pop up somewhere. I don't like everything to be too neat and tidy, so I do like loose ends or in the sense of not everything has to come back or have a deep meaning, right? I find it sometimes a little bit cheap when authors do that, where they dredge up some little detail and make it suddenly have this big importance. Um, but it is interesting what readers will connect with. But yeah, Tanner's whole function was to show up and so that in the first chapter you get a clear sense of who Adam is in relationship to when he's attracted to a guy, as well as there's a little bit of a flirtation and maybe just a kiss before things, of course, go south in a supernatural way, which is, my whole brand.
Yeah, and I just feel like there's something kind of queer about it too, because like I'll travel for a book thing or whatever, or like I'll travel for whatever reason. I'll get on the apps and I'll like have a pretty what feels super meaningful relationship with somebody primarily over text, and then I go home and I never think of them again, and I'm like, you know what, I'm good.
That's a very human thing when we travel, I think, too. I think I was about 21, 22. I met a guy at a party. It was one of my professors. I think he was her nephew. He was around my age, and he was amazing. And I basically fell in love for a day, right? I spent the whole day with this guy, had a wonderful time, had some of the best conversations, and I don't even think I could tell you his name now. But
Well, like you
yeah,
fantasize the whole
but it
future with
was
him. Like you're like, we could get married, we could live together, we'd have kids, it'd be so beautiful. Then you're like, you know what? I don't need to know who that person is after today.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how we can do that. We can have very brief but meaningful connections and collisions in our lives that go away. And of course, my old cat has woken up while we're talking. So sorry about that, all y'all. You'll get to hear him a little bit.
All right, so let's get a little bit into sort of like your writing journey. Like, how did you get into this? How did you like? When did you feel like? When did you get the writing bug, and when did you sort of like make that jump into trying it for real?
I grew up in Guthrie, Oklahoma, much like Adam in that series, and I grew up in the woods. And I had two older brothers who were much more what my parents expected a boy to be, right? They were much more sporty or hunting. My one brother is really into hunting and all that. And then I had a little sister who was very much what my parents wanted in a girl. So I didn't really kind of fit into their mold. And in a lot of ways, I was a spare because we wanted one son, one daughter. We ended up with four, and you're the third son. So we don't know what to do with you. Um, so I spent a lot of time by myself, and that was great because it let me create worlds in my head and create characters and stories. So I very early on, I was a very imaginative kid. Like I would take my Star Wars figures and I would cast them in different roles and make stories up about them and play in the mud and the sticks. So, and very early on, I loved science. I love speculative fiction. I love fantasy, sci-fi, in all of its forms, space opera. But really, the hardest thing was as I started getting a little bit older, I realized there was no place for us in it. We weren't welcome. If we were either a cliche or a stereotype or a villain, and it broke my heart. So it was a very natural progression of me for me to take that concept of myself and what I saw as stories I've been telling and try to create worlds around that and become an author. It took a lot longer than I wanted, partly because, like Adam, I'm a high school dropout. It took me a long time to graduate college. It took me a long time to learn essentially how to survive in the world uh, as an adult because my parents were, you know, kind of lost. And again, I didn't grow up with any kind of education or background, parents who knew how to teach us that. So it took a lot longer than I wanted, but I'm so happy to be here. And it's truly a lifelong dream to be able to write these books and share them with people.
Yeah, that's very resonant with me because I talked a lot about on the podcast about how for me, like I had a very late in life ADHD diagnosis, which is whenever I realized like, oh, so that's why I've been working 20 jobs and never staying anywhere for any more than a year. And that's whenever so like I feel like I'm starting so much later than I quote unquote should, because like I never like stuck with anything because I didn't know that that was like an impulse that I had that was like uncontrollable. So once I got the diagnosis, I was able to sort of like focus on a thing, and that's what sort of what writing has become for me is like a thing that I can focus on. So the idea of like sort of like bouncing around in life, but then also like doing what I think you're supposed to do, right? Like you're supposed to find a job and settle down and like just be what people think is like a normal life. And I think for people like us, for like creative people, like that's not the life that we see for ourselves. Like we want to be sort of like reaching for more or like telling stories or like whatever the thing is. And I think that that is something that is like universal to creative people is like, well, we're going against what we're supposed to do. And I don't think that any because everybody that I tell that I'm a writer, they're always like, "Oh, how exciting, how cool!" Like they love it, but it's like, "Oh, but I'd never do that for myself because I don't want to like divert my life journey," you know?
Yeah, very much so. And I have friends who writing is important to them or it's part of their life, but it's not their dream, it's not their goal. So they like, oh, I paint this other thing or I do these. They have other arts and expressions, and writing is one of their forms of expression. And it's one of the things I had to learn is what I want for my dream, what I want for myself is not what every writer wants for themselves, right? I have certain goals and ambitions, and it's completely okay. So if you are somebody listening to this and you are creative, it's completely okay if writing is something that you just do for fun. It's something it's okay if you do it for profit, or if you have a drive. Your writing is to you what it should be, and just define that and know it, but don't let anyone define it for you.
Yeah, and I think that it's just there's something about growing up in a home, especially. I imagine you probably can relate to this based on reading Anna Binder. Growing up in sort of like a very fundamentally Christian home, growing up in sort of like a rural area where like leaving is unusual, or at the very least, like leaving is something you immediately do and then find success instead of like trying to like be in the slums for years the way that you do when you're creative. And I think there's sort of this impulse that's like, well, I don't want to go against the grain. Like going against the grain is hard, and I don't want to like. And also, as a queer person, it's like I don't want to make my family. I'm already making them upset in this one specific way. I can't do it in this other way. Like it's too much, you know.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too we have to think about too is not everything has to be monetized, right? One of the things that happens to us is our creativity and our output doesn't always have to be about making money. It doesn't always have to be a job. And one of the annoying things about living in capitalism is I so often see somebody's like, oh, I'm really enjoying making this thing, like I'm making this art, and people's response will be, well, are you going to sell it? Are you going to put it on Etsy? Like, not everything needs to be about money. Not everything, creative fulfillment doesn't have to be just about profit.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty universal and true, especially in the U.S. Um, and and I think that it's something hard to come to terms with too, because like I think whenever you are creative and you're like, well, I'm gonna become a big star, and that's gonna be how I make a living, and then realizing like, well, if you're going to be an author, like it's truly a shot in the dark. Like if you might actually ever make a real living doing it, like most authors, even like huge ones, have day jobs, and it's like super unusual for somebody to be a full time author. Like that's the thing that's hard, I think, to come to terms with once you sort of like get in it. And like I'm at that place now where I sort of just started to realize that like I like the idea of people reading my stories and people knowing the things I write and people caring about the things that I create, and like that kind of has to be enough. And I think that that's hard to kind of like accept sometimes, and
Hmm.
especially kind of like come to terms with, because your dreams has to kind of shift a little bit once you realize that.
It's a painful realization. It's a really painful realization. I've met a couple of people who, they self-published their first book and they're really excited and they're like, "Oh, I'm there." I'm like, but then they realize, "Oh, wow, it's not. It is. It's a hard road. If it is the road for you, and I feel like it's the road for me, then yes, keep walking it. I'm close. I'm probably 3 or 4 books away from being able to write full time and quit my day job, which is an amazing accomplishment. I'm incredibly grateful for that. Uh, but I am aware of how rare it is, and it's taken me so long to get even this close to it. And I do feel like I'm winning the lottery in the sense of I'm seeing my books get out there. I have a great agent, I have a great publisher, very supportive of me, and it's very, very cool to finally like, okay, I this dream that I've had for so long is actually tangibly within reach. But every day I feel this enormous sense of gratitude because despite working on it solidly every day for 20 years, it is really a challenge for us to get there.
Yeah, so do me a favor and talk a little bit about like the getting into the trad pub part of it, because I don't have a ton of trad people on this podcast, so I'd love to hear sort of like some of your takes of being in the trenches, the query trenches. Like, what has that been like, and how did it feel once it finally, took?
It was amazing. So I'm on my second agent, just to kind of clarify my journey a little bit. I originally wrote Dark Moon, Shallow Sea was the second book that I wrote, and it was the book that got me my first agent. It didn't sell, it didn't make it, and I think it was honestly just a little too early for traditional publishing to get the idea of what a a book a book with a queer protagonist that had nothing to do with being gay. I just think it was too early, right? And I think if it had been YA and a couple of years later, or it might have landed better. So essentially, that wasn't working out, and I had written 2 epic fantasies by that point, and a third that's still 50% done somewhere in my drawers. But essentially, not those drawers, Terry. Um, so I essentially sent out Dark Moon, got an agent, and they weren't able to sell it. They weren't able to monetize it at the time. And part of it is I think the book had to grow. I had also queried a lot. I had been querying for a couple of years. I had queried 2 books at that point. I kept going back and rewriting, writing a new book, trying new stuff. But even after I got an agent, I still wasn't breaking out. At that point, I was getting really down because it had been a couple of years. I'd been represented. I had an agent, and I just wasn't getting anywhere. And I was starting to really hate writing. I was starting to think, well, okay, I if maybe traditional publishing isn't the way to go. And I do say that, both are valid paths. Like I do sometimes run into this static in the community of indie is great and agents are scum, or trad is great and indies aren't like real writers, and none of that's valid. Whatever your path to publication is, that's your path. And I know plenty of people who hybridize now too, right? And I may hybridize at some point as well. For example, I have a space opera that I really love, but there's really not like the market's really lean there right now. That might be something that I go hybrid with in a year or so. Anyway, my first agent wasn't essentially we just weren't getting anywhere. So I shifted agents. I got a new agent, and she was relatively new at it, but she had good connections. Her agency was very strong in the industry, and she was very enthusiastic about my work. So I shifted to her, and she she started querying my work and picking up threads, and we got a deal for one of my books. That this is my journey. My journey is like this. So I we got a deal, and then that publisher was having some problems, so we had to cancel that contract. But again, while I had been getting really down about it all, I had started writing something just for me. And I thought I was just going to put it on Wattpad or put it online. I thought, you know what? I'll just maybe if I love urban fantasy, but at the time urban fantasy wasn't selling very well. The second wave of it had kind of hadn't really hit yet. So, but I was like, you know what? I love urban fantasy, but again, where's the gay protagonist? Where's the stuff I love in urban fantasy? So I started writing this really weird book, and the more that I wrote it, it got gayer and stranger, and it was kind of funny, but also kind of dark and dealing with family trauma. And that morphed into White Trash Warlock. I thought I was just going to put it on the internet. I didn't think I was going to sell it, but I was just about done with it. I finished it off and a Sunday. It was a Sunday night. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and I finished it. And I sent it to my agent, and I said, "Hey, I think this maybe might be commercial. I know urban fantasy is a little rough right now, but you have a look." So I emailed it over to her at 10 o'clock at night. And my cat woke me up around, I think, 1, 2 in the morning for food or something. And I had a message from her saying, "This is phenomenal." So she was reading it. She got it at 10 o'clock at night and was still reading it, which is amazingly kind of her, right, to stay up late on a Sunday doing this for me, and because she was that enthusiastic. And then she texted the head of the agency, who I had copied, and said, "Are you reading this?" And she was on Eastern Standard Time, 2 hours ahead of us. Who then texted back and said, "Did you forget the time difference? It's like 3 a.m., 4 a.m." And my agent said, "No, get up and read this." So that ended up being my debut, and that's White Trash Warlock. So it was interesting how essentially throwing out the models of what I thought are running to market, and then after I did well with Warlock and its two sequels, Trailer Park Trickster and Deadbeat Druid, then my publisher was willing to take another look at an epic, right? And epic fantasy is very hard to break into, and I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand. I know so many people who write it, but when you go to the shelves and you go to your local bookstore and you look at epic fantasy, you're going to see 4 or 5 of the same names. You can guess who they are off the top of your head. They're rolling through your mind right now. And the thing is, epic fantasy books tend to be thicker and they tend to be more expensive. That means that the readership for it tends to be more narrow because everybody spends the same amount of money on entertainment a year. Most market research shows that. So what happens is when I go to buy a book, if I have $50 to spend on books in a year, I'm gonna probably buy one of those, and that's gonna take about 30 books, right? And maybe the other $30, maybe the other 20 is gonna go into somebody else. So Epic's a really narrow market. It does really well for those who are successful in it, but that's one thing I didn't understand is that it's easier sometimes to break out in something like urban fantasy or a different genre and then segue over. And you see authors like R.R. Bertie doing that. Jim Butcher, who wrote the Dresden Files, did that. He didn't write the Codex Alera until after. I don't know if he wrote it first, but I don't know where he published. He published Dresden Files first, and he had to get pretty successful in that before he could pivot over. So if you are writing epic fantasy, and I meet so many people at writing conferences who are, just understand that keep writing it. Don't give up on it. I'm so glad I never gave up on Dark Moon. And when they said, "Yeah, we'll try an epic off you," I picked it up and dusted it off, and I looked at it with my freelance editor and said, "Yeah, this is good, but it's been edited so much," and I just rewrote it. I applied everything I learned about writing to it, and we sent it off, and it ended up being published last year and doing really well. And again, it just won the Colorado Book Award, so it's obviously it was the right book. It just wasn't the right time.
Yeah, it kind of feels like what you really should do. Quote, I mean, and again, should doesn't exist. Should is like not a word that is real when it comes to what people do with their lives. But seems like the thing that makes the most sense is to write the thing that's most personal to you, right? Because like it seems like White Trash Warlock to you was something that was very personal and was like a story that you were able to tell that you put a lot of yourself into. And it seems like that's the thing that people connected to, because people always like something that I say a lot is like every piece of art has an audience. Everybody's going to love, like somebody's going to love something that you do. And I think that the more personal it is, the more likely you're going to find those people that really, really love your thing because they're going to connect with it too. Right.
Yeah, it's like dating. There's somebody for everyone. And if the person you're pursuing isn't, and I went through that when I was very young, and the guys I would crush on, they weren't into guys like me. They didn't want nerdy nerdy boys. I had to go find guys who like nerdy boys, and then I was like, oh, okay, these are the guys I need to be seeing, need to be dating. I had guys who would dump me when they found out I played Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that, and clearly I was chasing the wrong guys. Publishing's a lot like that. And art is a lot like that. There's an audience for your work. It might just take you a while to find it.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes people like to like not write the thing that they want to write because they're like it doesn't fit market or it is not going to sell or whatever. And it's like honestly, like fuck those people. Like just do what you want to do, and it doesn't have to make money. Like we said, like art doesn't have to make money. Like you're gonna find a place for yourself if you write the thing that is the most you. Is sort of like how I feel, you know.
That's so essential because you're going to have to look at that book or that piece of art 8,000 times. You are going to be so sick of it by the time it goes out there. And it's so nice. So to have Dark Moon out there now, I called Rafe, the main character, my feral firstborn, and he's like living in the basement of my brain for so long. And now he's finally moved out and he's paying rent and he's earning his keep and he's out of my head. And it's so nice. You are going to have to live with this art. For so long, and you need to believe in it. And a lot of people ask that, like agent feedback will often come with a comment of "I just didn't love it," and what they're saying is they don't have the passion for it to read it and fight for it over years and years that it can take for a work to publish. So if you are getting those kind of query rejections, and they're saying I just didn't love it, it doesn't mean it's a bad book. It doesn't mean that it's the wrong book or your work doesn't have merit. It just means that agent doesn't feel passionately enough about it to fight for it the way that you will as its creator.
Well, and I think too, like it is like I'm not gonna lie, it's like it is hard. It's hard to have to try to sell your book to a lot of people and then get a lot of people to say, I don't like this for that reason. I don't like this for this reason. Like it is hard because the thing is you gotta show it to as many people as possible to find those people that like it, right? Like that's part of the game. So like it is hard, but you kind of have to like it's part of it. You got to learn that it's part of it, you know.
It is. It was very funny to publish White Trash Warlock and have people asking me, I love this, but I would really love an epic fantasy. I'm like, me too. It's like, trust me, I've written the whole shelf of them. I'm trying. And it's really nice for people to be emailing me or messaging. I just got somebody on Twitter yesterday. I still can't just call it X. I just can't. Sounds like a porn site. Who messaged me to say, thank you so much. This is the book I wanted so much when I was a kid. Like yes, there you are. That's why I wrote it. Go forth. I'm so happy.
Welcome back to Strider fans. I'm joined once again with David Slayton, and we're going to talk about the idea of reluctant heroes because I feel like this comes up a lot in various media, and I think that both of us do it to some extent. Talk a little bit about kind of like why it was appealing to you, like what stood out to you about it.
Well, you see that with Adam in the Adam Binder series. Adam is a reluctant hero, partly because of his lack of resources. He doesn't have a lot of magic. He doesn't have a lot of power on this out there in the spiritual realm, and he's broke. He's gay. He doesn't have a lot of just resources. One of the reasons I wrote him that way is I love urban fantasy, but there are a couple of tropes and devices in it that I don't enjoy. One of which is when the hero strides onto the field in the first, moment, and he's throwing fireballs and he's super powerful and he's, such a badass. And it creates a couple of things for me. One, it creates the Sailor Moon problem, which is no shade on Sailor Moon. But if you start too powerful, you don't have anywhere to go to. And then you get these characters who very quickly are wielding godlike level abilities. And that causes your series to have to figure out a way around that problem. So I started Adam very low wattage for reason one, so I didn't have the Sailor Moon problem. He's not super powerful. He's not, it also gave me the second reason. So I could write toward it, right? I can write his growth. Like he has an arc of power growth and learning to do what he does better. The second reason that I wrote it is that it's funny because Adam is constantly in a state of being like around things that are really scary and much bigger and scarier than him. And so he's constantly like, let me see if I can foist the problem off on somebody else who it's in their pay grade, not mine, which of course he can't do. So he has to rise to the occasion. And that's generally where Adam's reluctance came from. For Rafe in Dark Moon Shallow Sea, his reluctance is essentially that his faith has been broken. His faith in the world and humanity, his goddess is dead. He literally doesn't think there's any hope for anything. All he really wants is some payback and revenge. And through the course of that journey, he learns to have faith again. And he learns to be able to overcome that so that his reluctance allows him to rise to the occasion of what the world needs to be saved.
Yeah, I like to do reluctant because I feel like there's something relatable about it. It was relatable to me anyway, which is this idea that you're good at a thing and people tell you that you're good at a thing and you need to do that thing for a living, but it's not the thing you want to do. That's what it feels really relatable to me. It's like my protagonist is a chosen one, but he really wants to be a musician. He doesn't want to save the world. He wants to be a musician, but like he understands he has to save the world because like it's his responsibility. But like he loved to not have to do that, and that just seems super relatable to me because I feel like there's so many times in life whenever people are like, "Well, you're good at math, so you should be an accountant," or "You're good at math, so you should be an architect," or whatever. People are like, "But I love acting. Like I don't want to do math." And I think that there's something sort of like very capitalist and very like modern about that. That you know we're told we're good at a thing and we have to do it for a living, but like sometimes you don't want to.
I also think there could be an angle to that since we're both queer writers writing queer characters. I think we're also looking at it from the sense of we think a lot about conformity, right? We've been told to conform in our life. We've been told to, not walk that way or talk that way, not wear that. And it's a way to kind of work some of that out through our characters for them to have a path chosen for them. My book, Rogue Community College, it's out in October. It really tries to invert the chosen one trope because its tagline is chosen ones go to elite schools of magic. This one is for everybody else. Because I really don't like chosen one. I don't write the hero's journey, I write the heroines. I write found family and larger groups of essentially moving from being a solo person and alone to becoming part of that found family relationship. And then I didn't understand that I wrote that until I took Gail Carriger's workshop on it, by the way. So it's very like, oh, that's what I write. The Heroine's Journey is an inversion, and I highly recommend her book on the topic. So it's very thin, very cheap, and but it really educate you more if you're trying to look at the problem of the solo hero, the Wonder Woman who saves the day but ends up alone, first movie, versus a character who essentially forms a collective and a group of people, which I think speaks so deeply to the LGBTQ experience.
Yeah, and I mean, I never even thought about it that way, but in my book series, there are purposefully more than one chosen one. Like there's a group of chosen ones, and they're very segmented and separate. But then the idea is they'll eventually come together and do something together. And I didn't even think about that being as like part of the queer experience. But you're so right. Like it really is. Like the idea of I'm unique and strange and weird, and I want to find people like me. And then like ultimately, that's the goal. Ultimately, you do. Like once you come out and you meet other people, you're like, oh hey, I'm not so alone in this thing that I thought was just me. Like it is actually like you're right. It's really reflective of that.
It's funny too because it can take you a while. I talked in our last segment a little bit about this. It can take you a while to find your niche in the writing community. It can take a while for you to find your niche in the queer community. Certainly did for me. Again, I was a nerdy boy, kind of bookish, and was not a muscle boy. And it was important for me to sift around until I found my group, as it were. And it's like, oh, these are my people. So it's nice. It's nice to finally have found them.
Well, and two, I think the other thing too is like a lot of times people will say, people like me or people that look like me. I think in the queer community that's not actually like always true. Like I like having a diverse group of queer friends who are, various kinds of queer that maybe don't reflect my experience fully, but they get what I'm going through, and I think that that's something I think it's probably not specific to the queer experience because I feel like probably like immigrants probably like immigrant kids probably go through that, or like the one black kid in a small town that moved to a bigger city probably has gone through that. But it does feel like something that I think it goes back to how like all our experiences are pretty universal, because if you're not the culture, like the majority culture, you're gonna feel outside of it. So like you just need to find people that get what that's like.
Yeah, it was really interesting back in my brief club kid days in my mid 20s, which was, dinosaurs walked the earth. But back then, I'd go clubbing and there would be people there that there were disabled people, right? There were people there who clearly weren't there to dance, right? And but they were enjoying themselves, and they were part of the community. And as I got to know some of them, I would ask them, it's like, well, are you gay? Are you? They're like, no, I'm not, but I feel welcome here, and I loved that. I loved that our community had a place for everyone, and I loved that they felt comfortable being with us in that environment. And it was, I don't know, it always just warms you to remember those conversations and those days.
Yeah, I wonder if you've experienced that with like readers of your book. Like, have you found readers that aren't queer, but found a lot of themselves in your characters? Is that a thing that you've ran into?
Yeah, I have a couple. I've had a couple of straight guy readers who have really, and one of them's become a friend of mine, and we talk a lot about it. Just he just identifies with the experience, and reading the Adam Binder series particularly, even if you're not gay like Adam is, like I am, I think a lot of people do relate to being different in a rural environment when it is more you're more isolated. A lot of people relate to the poverty. They relate to Adam's experience beyond just being gay, but being a little bit nerdy or being a little bit weird in there in that setting, which is how I felt in it. And one of the nicest things about those conversations is they're like, I know that you get it because you get the food right. Like the food that Adam eats is the food that I ate. And he grew up in the trailer that he grew up in is modeled on the trailer that I grew up in. Like these are my experiences that I wrote in. So, and some of the stuff with his family, which I won't spoil too much, but there's definitely some family trauma there and abuse. It's very rewarding to have people connect with these books and not to just see them as gay books, but to see them as books that speak to other experiences as well. And I really appreciate that readership is there and that they found them. And I'm so glad.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting and heartening to hear that from you because you see things like that review of Turning Red by Pixar where the author was like, I'm not a Korean girl from Canada, so I don't understand this movie. It's not for me. And it's like, no, but you went through puberty and you had new attractions and you probably had a family that had expectations for you that you didn't necessarily want. Like, I feel like those are things that are pretty universal. And and I think that that's the thing that's so weird about like people that are so railing against diversity is like I remember seeing a response to The Acolyte, the new Star Wars show that everybody either loves or hates. It seems to be the main response. But I saw a response to it where somebody was like, "There was no white male leads in this," and I was like, I didn't even notice that whenever I watched it, and it's wild that you did that you were looking for that and you did.
I think, well, first of all, just speaking to the Acolyte, and I haven't finished it, but I had somebody on TikTok an astronomer of all people, she said, I love it because it's a YA novel. And if you look at it through the lens of a YA novel, the plot and everything and all of the character development adds up in so many different ways. I was like, oh yeah, it's like that clicked so hard. Um, but I get bored, right? So part of those old days when I was clubbing, I would go to these parties and it would just be white gay dudes, and they all worked out so many hours a day, and they all had blonde hair. It was this like very homogenized look and place, and I was so bored. It was like, where are the women? Where are the people of color? Where are the different body types? Like, what is this? It's just this one experience that you're narrowing your friend group to, and I just like, this is not the scene for me. So it was so nice to. It's so nice when now we're in a place where we do get all these different experiences. We do get all this not just looks and feels with diversity, and it exposes you to things, and you see stuff that is new and shiny. And um, I just think that's so cool. I think it's so important that we try to get outside of our own head whenever we can. And as a writer, I don't know about you, but for me, it's like it's a compost heap, right? Every experience, everything that I try and do goes in here and helps generate new ideas and helps fertilize creativity. And I would be so bored if I just, stayed right here in my little space with my little group of friends and never tried to mix it up at all.
Yeah, and I like to sort of come from the school of thought that like people love to say that like no there's no new songs, every song has been written, every story's been written. I feel like to some extent like the structure is sort of true. Like most stories have been like the story structure has sort of been told. But it is so interesting when you do add diversity to it, it makes it a different story, right? Like Wonder Woman the movie is not that different than most of the superhero movies. but it felt very different because it was a woman in the lead. Her experiences were shaped by her being a woman. Or like Black Panther, for example, is like another movie like that. Like we've seen utopian societies before, but a utopian society that's fully black that wasn't invaded by like colonizers, that's so wildly unique. And it's because of the diversity, you know?
And it was so important. It was so critical for Black people to have that movie. And watching it, I'm not lessened by I'm not lessened by her being a movie that's all Black protagonists and winning it, winning this thing and dealing with this thing and internally to them. That's not in any way lessening my experience as as a white male. It's so frustrating to think like the visceral reaction some people have had to Barbie is a really good example of this, right? I think Barbie is so clever and brilliant, and it's such an interesting existential film, and it's okay. It's okay that I'm not centered in that, that and that I can go witness that and I can see that experience, and I again it feeds my creative spirit to see something completely different from my own experience. And just circling back to it, I'm so happy there are readers out there reading my stuff, and they're not shirking because it's a gay guy. They're looking at all the other things that I'm trying to do and talk about in this book.
Well, and I think that maybe if you've not experienced it before, like where you've really connected to somebody who is not at all like you, um, maybe it's surprising to you that like these diverse things can connect. And like I don't know what it's like to be a straight, person. So I don't know what it's like to have seen myself centered in practically every story. So like, but for me, like I remember seeing like sort of diverse things. Like I think about things like the Mindy Project, like Mindy Kaling's sitcom, where she was like a little girl in love with romantic comedies that she connected with because her family wanted different things for her, but she really loved this thing. As a nerdy kid that was queer in a small town, I was like, I get that. Like that is very much my journey also. Even though you're, an immigrant kid from, like New York or whatever. Like it's your story is my story, even though it's not really. And I think that that's something that maybe if you've not experienced like that kind of thing where you're like, I'm so much like this, like, you know, Indian woman that you don't understand that. But like it is like you can connect with somebody's story because there are so many parallels, even if they're not exactly your story, you know?
Oh yeah, the human experience is universal. We all love, we all hate, we all have love. Our emotions are generally universal, right? And obviously there are all the multitudes of flavors and diversity inside that. That's why Star Trek works so well. The aliens are human. Even the aliens who work their hardest to not be human, like the Vulcans, Spock is half human, and struggling with his human side and understanding it is what makes him such a fascinating character, to use his favorite word. So I find that beautiful. Um, and when I wrote White Trash Warlock, I wasn't just wanting to write about a gay character. I wanted to write about a rural character because it's urban fantasy, but urban fantasy usually takes place in Chicago, New York, Stephen Blackmore's gorgeous Eric Carter series, which is gritty and dark and fascinating. But they take place in these very large cities. Nobody's had written about somebody from Guthrie, Oklahoma. Nobody, I wanted something that was kind of rural fantasy. And then he comes to Denver and you get to see those two worlds clash. But that was the other thing I wanted to showcase, not just a gay lead, but and more important to me in many ways was having a rural protagonist come into an urban environment as opposed to working out of a massive city like Chicago.
Yeah, and I think that's become so clear that we need stories like that from like the rise of someone like Trump because like they needed a voice, right? Is in a lot of ways like why because he spoke to a lot of the things that they were frustrated about, you know, and I think that you're right. Like we need more stories that tell their stories, but in a way that resonates that isn't destructive, you know, the same way that someone like he is.
Yeah, I was talking to a romance editor a couple of years before I wrote my rom-com, which was interesting because she was telling me about romance readership, and romance readership is still largely rural and southern, so they still see places like New York as exotic and different, right? They haven't been there, they haven't experienced that, and it's one of the divides I wish that I could heal, and it's one of the divides I hope that my work could heal a little bit. Is this idea, like I talked to my family back in Oklahoma, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, you live in Denver, you're gonna." you're gonna, are you okay? Are you safe? I'm like, I don't live in some urban hellscape. Like, there's this idea that the cities are, all on fire and burning everywhere. And um, it was one of the things that a conversation I had with my mother regularly before she passed, when I would travel and I was going to Greece, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, be so careful." I'm like, "Mom, my chances of getting hurt by violent crime are so much higher in any American city than they are anywhere in Europe that I go to." And I'm happy to show you statistics, right? Like, I'm going to Athens, I'm going to, out to rural Greece, but I feel way safer there. I was like, my chances of, of having to deal with violence and harm are so much higher here in the States. But trying to break through some of that isolationist mentality was a challenge.
Yeah, and like it doesn't help that most of the things that mainstream audiences watch are like Law and Order shows and things like that that showcase crime on a regular basis in urban environments. And also the fact that there's a Republican ecosystem, media ecosystem that lives on fear and loves to make people afraid of the people that aren't them. Like none of those things are helpful when it comes to trying to tell those stories.
Well, and I have to laugh. I have to laugh about the Law and Order thing because in Greece, I met a woman in Thebes, which is a very small town now and very rural in a lot of ways. And she called it a village. That was her word for it. And she had married. She was from Athens, but she married a guy from there and moved back for him. And she was like, we went to America and we got off the plane, and our first reaction was, "Who are going to be the murderers? Who's going to kill us?" Because they had watched too much like Law and Order, so they thought all of America is just murder everywhere constantly. Like, and but again, it's that cultural misconception because of the television they were watching. They thought that all of our cities were just like that.
Yeah, so I think we're probably gonna wrap up soon. But just to kind of like cap us off, um, I'd love to hear like how you would advise people, because as a person from a rural area, what would you tell to like rural people living in a rural area working a job that they hate but they really want to be creative in whatever way it is for them? What would you say to them?
Be selfish with your time. And I have a friend who's a writer right now, and she's retired. She has time, but her husband's constantly interrupting her because he works from home and he's very extroverted. And I'm like, you put a sign on your door that says, unless you're bleeding, don't knock on this door. I'm working. Or you leave the house. You go to Panera, and right there if you need to. They have, like, turn off the Wi-Fi on your computer. You have to make dedicated time for your creativity if it is the thing that feeds your soul. Like, my partner's wonderful, but if my office doors are closed, you can't see them because they're on the other side. They're these two sliding doors, barn doors, and he knows that those doors are closed and I'm working. Don't bother me. The only person who's allowed to interrupt me is the cat. So you have to be selfish about it, and you may not have much space. I'm very lucky now that I have a house, but back when I was living in a studio apartment with my now ex, I would go find a coffee shop, buy a cup of coffee for $1.50, and it was that cheap back then, and sit and work. So do what you have to do to be selfish about your time and treat it like a job. Um, I'm not saying monetize it, right? Again, we talked about that in our earlier segment, but not everything needs to be monetized or capitalized, as it were. However, you need to treat it as something that's important to you. And so be selfish. Be selfish about that time. Be selfish about the space that you make for it. Even if it's just 2 square feet, right? Where you've got you and your laptop or your notebook. That's your time and that's important to you. And the people in your life need to respect it. Um, and if you have to carve out that space however you can. I have a day job. I still have a full-time day job, and I now have enough contracts and stuff that I have a full-time writing job. That means I get up at 5 a.m. and it sucks. But my partner's still asleep. My day job hasn't come online yet. And that gives me 2 to 3 hours every morning that are mine to write. So I make the coffee, I feed the cat, and I get to work. Find the time that works for you. That could be midnight when the kids have gone to bed. It could be the back porch on a Saturday morning, but whatever time or space you carve out for your work when you can, treat it, be selfish about it, be greedy about it, because it's yours and it's precious.
I love that. That's so great. So tell me, if people want to find out more about you, where should they go to read your books, to find anything else? Anything else you might want to find out about you?
Sure. If you want to know anything about me, just go to davidslayton.com. Just don't forget the R, or you might find some Florida man types. But if you internet search me, Google me, I'll pop right up. just David R. Slayton Books or David Slayton Books. There are other David Slaytons out there doing things in the world, so the R does helpful, and I'm sure they get annoyed getting my email. Um, but yeah, and my books are available anywhere. If they don't have them in your little indie shop, you can order them in. You can get them online. They're also really good on audio. My narrator does a really good job, and I'm happy to say he's narrating Rogue Community College. I just found out this week, so I'm excited. But yeah, just look for me. You can find me anywhere.